To go ahead. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our October event at Pieces of Me Foundation, where we have been holding a monthly event with the common thread of raising awareness so that we can fulfill our mission of erasing the stigma surrounding disability and chronic illness. Tonight, we're going to talk about that fundamental right as Americans to cast an independent and private vote, which, as some of you already know, is not necessarily guaranteed as of yet in practice for those of us that have disabilities. There's a lot of work to be done. And so I'm glad to have our guests with us tonight to talk about this, and Fred will introduce them in a moment. But for those of you who are new to us, we are a organization that is based in Arizona, but has team members spread throughout the country. And, you know, we're proud to have supporters in various countries all over the world with different characteristics, different philosophies, different points of view, but all with the same aim of really creating opportunity and a community where everyone can thrive. So with that, I would like to introduce Fred Brown, who is one of our board members and a valued team member. He's been with us for the last couple of years and has really done a lot of things to be incredibly valuable to our team. And I'm grateful to him for facilitating this panel. And with that, Fred, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Daniel. Thanks for the very, very kind words. So we're going to have this webinar, this nice discussion about accessible voting and the rights of voters with disabilities. So just as a real brief overview, so individuals with disabilities face, unfortunately, many barriers in exercising their voting rights. But on the upside, there are legal rights that individuals with disabilities have under the law as far as access to voting. So this webinar in general is going to discuss the barriers and the voting accessibility rights and how individuals with disabilities can protect their rights to accessible voting. So I'll just give a brief introduction myself first. So as Daniel said, I'm a member of Pieces of Me. I've been doing this for a few years. It's an incredibly valuable organization, and I do what I can to help. My day job is I'm a law professor at the University of Baltimore. My area of expertise is tax and business. It's not voting rights, it's not disability law, but I am learning quite a bit just through my interactions with the great members of Pieces of Me. But thankfully, we do have two experts when it comes to accessible voting on our panel for tonight. So we have Luann Blake, who's with the National Federation of the Blind, and we have Alyssa Fia, who used to be with Disability Rights Maryland. So I'm going to let Luann and Alyssa just give some maybe further introduction, and then we're going to just go right to an agenda where we're going to discuss some of these issues.
Okay. Shall I go first?
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Fred. I appreciate that. It's great to be with you all this evening. I hope that we're able to provide some valuable information and answer any questions that you may have. My name is Luann Blake. I am Director of Research Programs in Blindness Initiatives at the National Federation of the Blind. I've been with the NFB for 17 years now. Probably 15 of those years I've been working in voting advocacy, focusing primarily on the rights of blind and low vision voters, as well as deafblind voters. We have had a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services under the Help America Vote Act to provide technical and training assistance to voting advocates in the protection and advocacy system throughout the United States. We also work with election technology vendors to help them make their products more accessible to blind and low vision voters. We also work with election officials to help them make the entire elections process more accessible. So that's me.
Let me just add too that the great work that Luann and the National Federation of the Blind do was just highlighted only yesterday in the Baltimore Sun article. So I don't know if people had a chance to see that, but congratulations and thank you all for the great work that you and your organization do.
Thank you.
Alyssa?
Yeah, so my name's Alyssa Fio. I have been a disability rights attorney for 27 years, I think. Yeah, long time. Well, long time. So for much of that time, my focus has been on education, representing students with disabilities in the education realm. I came to Disability Rights Maryland in 1998, and I left there in 2018, but in the 10 years before leaving, I worked on voting rights advocacy along with Luann. We did a lot of work together, traveled the state training election judges, and we did that work under the Help America Vote Act, which we'll talk about. So after leaving Disability Rights Maryland, I went on to University of Baltimore Law School, where I got to know Fred and Daniel. And I'm now currently at the Maryland Office of the Public Defender doing education work on behalf of kids who are involved in that system. I've always been an advocate for blending both voting rights and education. So for students with disabilities who have individual education program and IEP, they are supposed to have transition planning when they turn 16. And I've always thought that voting should be part of that transition plan to prepare students for becoming members of our democracy. So I am no longer an expert. I was an expert for 10 years. So I'm here to add to the conversation and contribute to my experience and some of the things that we worked on over those 10 years. And I'm really happy to be here. So thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. You're certainly a relative.
I'm definitely a relative. Yeah.
Okay, so the first, I guess, just as far as just describing some of the barriers that individuals with disabilities face. So I think that would be a good way to start this. And so I think Alyssa and Luann both want to comment on that. So whoever wants to go first.
Luann, I'll let you go and I'll add anything that you don't cover there.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Alyssa. So voters with disabilities face barriers both in-person voting at an early voting center or at the polling place on election day, and they also face barriers with absentee voting or vote by mail, as we now call it in Maryland and many other states call it. So again, my expertise is primarily in blind and low vision voters. So I'll talk about that, and Alyssa can probably fill in about voters with other disabilities. And primarily voters with print disabilities, it's not just blind and low vision voters, it's also in many instances, voters who don't have the manual dexterity to handle a paper ballot. So frequently we all kind of get lumped into that one category, voters with print disabilities. Anyway, so the National Federation of the Blind has conducted a survey of blind and low vision voters following every presidential election and a number of midterm elections, including this year, to find out what their experience was in voting. And for the last 2 election cycles that we've done this survey, we've done 2 surveys, actually, one for blind and low vision voters who voted in person, and also blind and low vision voters who voted by mail. And so in-person voting, a common problem that blind voters face is they show up at the polling place only to find out that the accessible ballot marking device has not been set up. And this consistently has been an experience that a quarter to a third of the voters who completed our survey had when they showed up at the polling place. So this means that they either have to wait for the poll workers to get the machine set up. And frequently that means they have to figure out how to set the machine up because they don't really know, or they don't remember from their training that they got. Or they have to go, leave and come back later. Also, unfortunately, sometimes it means that these voters end up voting with assistants, having two poll judges mark their ballot for them, or someone else. So that is a huge problem. And the lack of knowledge that poll workers have about the accessible ballot marking device, how to set it up, how the accessibility features work, is also consistently a problem that blind and low vision voters face when they go to the polling place. Another barrier that voters with disabilities face when they go to in-person voting is that poll workers don't know how to interact with them in an appropriate manner. For example, if a blind voter shows up at the polling place with a family member or a friend, the election worker may talk to that friend rather than speak directly to the voter. They may also grab the blind voter in an attempt to direct them where to go. That's not appropriate also. So speak directly to the blind voter and give them verbal directions on where they need to go is the preferred way to interact with a blind voter. Another issue that voters who use the ballot marking device at polling places may encounter. It depends on how the ballot marking device is implemented. But if it's only voters with disabilities that are using the ballot marking device, it's not, there are some ballot marking devices out there that produce a ballot that's different in size and content from the hand marked ballot. So if it's only voters with disabilities that are using that machine, and there needs to be a hand count, a recount of the ballots after the election, when those ballots are taken out of the ballot box, they are easily identifiable as having been cast by a voter with a disability. So that's not a secret ballot. So I think those are the primary barriers that blind and low vision voters face at the polling place. We also have a lot of barriers when it comes to vote by mail. Traditionally, voting by mail has been on a paper ballot that gets mailed to your home address. And by its very nature, a paper ballot is not accessible to a blind or low vision voter. There are systems that can deliver a ballot electronically so that a voter who is blind or low vision can use their own computer with their own access technology, be that a screen reader or screen magnification, to access the ballot and mark the ballot. This year, with this current election cycle, slightly more than half the states provide that to voters with disabilities. And there's also a few states, about 10, that permit those ballots to be returned electronically after they've been marked. So we still have a ways to go when it comes to vote by mail. Depending on where you live, you may or may not have an accessible way to mark those ballots. In states that do not permit electronic return, after you've marked your ballot privately and independently, you then have to print the ballot. That's another barrier that voters may face. A lot of blind voters don't have printers. So that means that they either have to find a computer connected to a printer that also has their access technology so they can print it out, or they have to have someone else print out their ballot, which, has privacy implications. So the inability to return their ballot electronically actually keeps a number of voters with print disabilities from using these systems. And I think I will leave it at that for now and let Alyssa chime in.
Yeah, so at Disability Rights Maryland, we were working cross disability. So while we were working with the National Federation of Blind, we were also assisting other organizations and other individuals with various disabilities. One area that we discovered was that individuals who had perhaps a disability that required them to be under guardianship were excluded from voting. Full stop, with no exclusion in Maryland. We worked for several years to get that law changed so that a person who is under guardianship, because you might be under guardianship for a number of reasons, doesn't mean that you can't have an opinion and exercise your right to vote. But there are still guardianship provisions or restrictions nationally that prevent individuals who have a disability that requires them to be under guardianship, either for financial reasons or living reasons, that prevents them from voting. So that's one particular area that is a very real barrier. There's also barriers for individuals who have a mental health disability, and they might be in a facility or a psychiatric hospital. Those individuals do not lose their right to vote, and it really is incumbent upon the facility to ensure that the individuals in that facility have access to the voting process. We also had a voter hotline that we would man with every election. And so that would help us identify the issues that voters were facing. Individuals who had physical disabilities who needed accessible entrances. There was always every year some issues. While it's very clear that the voting site has to be accessible, there are heavy doors that have to be propped open. I remember one situation where a dump truck or a trash truck was blocking the accessible entrance. There has to be signage. So if there is one accessible entrance, person has to be able to see that sign or be advised that the accessible entrance is somewhere else. So there were always those kinds of issues. Voter assistance also became an issue and an area of concern. We'll talk a little bit about the law, but basically a voter has the right to determine who they want to provide assistance. It doesn't mean that they can't get assistance by a poll worker or an election judge. They can, but they can also bring someone of their choice in to provide voter assistance. And that does not mean that that person is voting for them. It means that they are providing them assistance as they determine is needed. So that was always an area of concern. And Luann mentioned about election judges. We spend a lot of time, and I know NFB is continuing training election judges because election judges cycle in and out. You have to continually train, not only in the accessible features of the voting machines, but in cultural competence on how to interact with voters, as Luann stated, how to provide proper assistance, how to communicate, how to ensure that you have the tools that a voter might need. If you have a voter who has a hearing disability, you might have to have paper and pen. We also talked about having a ruler when you have to sign, so that someone who has a vision disability will be signing on the correct line. So there are lots of things that go into thinking kind of about the entire experience, from registration to actually casting the ballot, to getting information that's accessible about the election generally. So it's kind of that entire process from beginning to end, ensuring that at every aspect, at every stage, the accessibility is thought of and considered and provided. So did I miss anything, Luann?
I think you've covered it well, Alyssa.
Okay.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive from both of you. Also, too, if people have questions, so what we plan to do is actually have a question and answer period towards the end. So if you can just please hold those until the end of our discussion. So, Alyssa, you mentioned, of course, there are laws out there, right? I think most of us know about the ADA. I think there's also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I imagine that they hopefully do provide some protection to ensure or at least advance accessible voting. So I don't know. I think Alyssa, I think you wanted to maybe talk.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go through real quickly and real kind of broadly. So we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what that does, among other things, but the most important points for our purposes today, requires a person with a disability to receive assistance from a person of the voter's choice, number one. It also prohibits conditioning voting a person's ability to read or write or attaining an education level or passing any kind of test. So that really addresses the issue of individuals with a cognitive disability, a reading disability, a learning disability. We don't test, make sure when you go to vote that you are fully informed on every issue and know everything about every candidate. My right to vote for someone because I like the way they look or I like the way they sound is my right. And so that applies to everyone. We also have the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, otherwise known as NVRA. And that act was really to increase voter participation. And there's an interesting point about that act, which many people don't know, is that it requires all offices that provide public assistance or state-funded programs that primarily serve people with disabilities to also provide the opportunity to register to vote in federal elections. And that means that if you go to the office for paratransit in order to get that service of accessible transportation, public transportation, they are required to also offer you the opportunity to vote. Doesn't happen, but in Maryland, but that's what should happen. If you go to an office on a university campus that serves students with disabilities, they should be offering you the right to vote. So the same way, if you go to VA, Motor Vehicle Administration, you get that offer of voter registration. That is supposed to happen in other offices that serves people with disabilities. We mentioned the ADA, and that's Title II, and it ensures full and equal opportunity to vote. And again, it applies to every aspect of the voting process: registration, accessible polls, accessible voting system, and casting the ballot. And then we have HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, and that was passed in 2002. And that act was interesting in that it provided a lot of funding to states and to organizations that serve people with disabilities to ensure that there were accessible voting systems. And it requires that there be at least one accessible voting system in each polling place, and to ensure that there's the same opportunity to vote privately and independently. And that's really the key and the hallmark. I know we're going to talk about privacy of the vote and independence, but that really is the main goal, is to allow a person to retain the privacy of their vote, to keep it secret, and to vote independently. Did I forget any others? Obviously, we've got the polling place. There's an ADA checklist for polling places, which is very comprehensive, which talks about the parking, the accessible entrance, the signage. So there's a lot of resources out there for election officials to ensure that polling sites and the election process is in fact accessible. It often comes down to a matter of funds and money and training. But those are the main laws that impact this process. Luann, did I forget anything?
Well, yeah, I think I would also add Title II of the ADA,
ADA, right.
Americans
Yep.
with Disabilities Act.
Yeah.
That requires that voters with disabilities be provided an opportunity to vote privately and independently that's equal to the opportunity provided to voters without
Right.
disabilities. And I would also add Section 504 of the Rehabilitation
Oh, right.
Act.
Yes, which follows ADA. Yeah.
Right. Yep. And that prohibits any entity that receives federal funding prohibits them from discriminating against people with disabilities in their services or programs. So those two federal laws are actually what the National Federation of Blind uses to litigate their cases in federal court when they're litigating discrimination against blind voters.
Yeah.
So-
So I was just going to say, under the Help America Vote Act, you don't have a private cause of action.
That's right.
Yeah.
You do not.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. So how are these rights enforced? So I guess in some cases there are private rights of action, but is there any federal agency that is ensuring that these things are being complied with?
Well, Department of Justice enforces HAVA, but they are very slow, very slow to get things done. For example, in 2020, when many elections, most elections probably that year, were being moved from in-person voting to primarily vote by mail, and the vast majority of states did not have an accessible way to vote by mail. There were many cases brought that year in federal court by entities other than DOJ, and a number of NFB affiliates filed complaints with DOJ over the lack of their state to provide an accessible way to vote by mail, and none of those complaints have been acted upon to date by DOJ. So HAVA is not the way to go, unfortunately.
There is also the right to file a complaint under HAVA with your state election officials. Which is a little odd, because if you're arguing that they're investigating themselves, really, right? I'm not sure if that's the way it works, but I know you file it with the state election officials. I think, Luann, you were saying that those complaints also haven't really gone anywhere.
No, those don't generally go anywhere either. Yeah.
That's unfortunate.
The other thing to say is maybe we'll talk about this, but later, but for individuals who are having issues on election day or during early voting, there are election hotlines. So there is an election protection hotline, which collects complaints around the country, and really it's so important to document the issues that individuals are facing, because what seems to happen is, you go through an election, there are these complaints, and you're not going to have another election till like 2 years later or 4 years later, and they kind of lose steam unless you're the NFB and you sue. So it is important to document the complaint and call one election protection to lodge that complaint, so it's documented somewhere.
Okay, great. Well, so I think both of you have alluded to privacy issues. So I think maybe, Alyssa, you wanted to maybe talk about that. So I guess, and Luann as well, but I guess there are sort of two questions. So first of all, how is an individual's privacy rights affected by the voting system? And then second, what legal rights do people have to protect their rights to privacy when they're exercising their votes?
So the right to privacy can be impacted in many ways. A voter with a disability or disabilities may have to rely on someone for assistance. And just by that nature of having to rely on someone, your privacy is impacted, right? If you are using the ballot marking device, which for those who might not know what we're talking about is, like in Maryland, for example, we used to vote on touch screen machines. So you would just vote on your machine and it would actually cast the ballot. Now we vote on paper, marking the ballot either by hand or using a ballot marking device. And what Luann was talking about is those two documents don't match. So the paper hand marked ballot does not match the ballot size and shape and size as the ballot that goes and feeds into the machine for the ballot marking device. But even when you use a ballot marking device, that ballot gets, shot out of the machine. You have to take it over, or someone has to take it over for you to actually be inserted to cast the ballot. Marking it doesn't cast it. You have to then put it into another machine so it's then counted. Maryland has been using the privacy sleeve, I think, Luann, right? They use a privacy sleeve if the election judge knows to use a
Yes
privacy
and no.
sleeve.
Yeah, yes and no.
Right, but so just by nature of it coming out of the machine and having to get across the room to, in my polling place anyway, it goes all the way across the room. The ballot is not necessarily private in that way. So that also impacts it. If you're voting by home and you don't have the ballot marking capability at home, you might be relying based on your disability for assistance there, and that also impacts the privacy of the vote. What am I missing, Luann?
Well, from voting from home, again, if you are able to use a accessible vote by mail system, like an online ballot marking tool that we have here in Maryland, but then we have to print out the ballot. If you don't have a printer, then again, you've got to find a printer or a computer connected to a printer that you can use that has your access technology, or have someone else print the ballot for you. And having someone else print the ballot for you certainly has some privacy concerns there. If you are voting on a paper ballot, a paper by mail ballot, a blind voter has to tell their choices to someone else, and then trust that person marks their ballot as instructed. So that's definitely a privacy issue.
But you mentioned something about having a sleeve to protect some of the confidentiality of these ballots. So I guess my broader question, are there requirements under federal law that polling places do have to have, things in place to protect the privacy of people who vote in, somewhat different ways?
Well, so HAVA does reference privacy and independence, and many state constitutions reference a secret ballot. Not all, but many do. And it is also kind of, I know not necessarily something to litigate, but it's just kind of a general understanding that one of the fundamental rights in voting is that your ballot, your vote is secret, is private. And that was to guard against coercion and bribery in the kind of in the Wild West of voting. And I think it was like 1888 actually, where really the issue of a private ballot really took hold and became kind of embedded into the constitutions of states. But HAVA does reference private and independent.
Right. Well, it's also the intimidation factor too. People sometimes want to vote. They want to keep their vote to themselves.
Right.
Don't want others to know how they're voting. Okay, very good. So you've kind of both alluded to, in general, issues that individuals with disabilities face when voting. Are there experiences of voters with disabilities that you'd like to share? Particular, not name names, obviously, but just particular examples.
Sure. I can talk about my own experience that I've had. This was prior to 2016 here in Maryland. Before 2016, all voters in Maryland used the same voting machine. It was the Diebold machine. Yes, it had a touch screen. It also had an audio ballot capability. The tricky thing about that machine was that if you wanted to use the audio ballot, you had to tell the election judge that when you signed in. And the election judge, when they were loading your information onto the card that was inserted into the machine, had to check a box to enable the audio ballot. And if that box was not checked, the audio ballot would not start. So frequently it was my experience that, I would show up at the polling place and I would tell the election judge that I want to use the audio ballot. And many times I could tell from the reaction that I got from the election judge that they didn't really know what I was talking about. And so then I'd take the card. It was like the size of a credit card that you inserted into the machine. And from that, the information on that card told the machine which ballot you were to use. And if the box is checked, it will also tell the machine to start the audio ballot. Well, frequently when I put the card into the machine, not too much, no surprise to me, the audio ballot wouldn't start. So then I would report that to the election judge. And at the time, I had more vision than I do now. I am blind, but I have some vision. And so the first response from the election judge, nine times out of 10 was, oh, well, you can use the touch screen. And I'm like, no, I want to use the audio ballot. And you need to check the box when you're loading the card. And frequently, it was always my experience that they were able to figure it out eventually. But I, would have to stand my ground and insist that I wanted to use the audio ballot and wait for them to figure it out. And I've heard similar experiences from many other blind voters throughout the United States. For example, I back in 2020, I had a story from a blind voter in Georgia who went to their polling place and requested to use the accessible ballot marking device. And when they went to vote on that machine, there was no audio ballot. And the poll workers, attempted to get the audio ballot to work. They would keep asking the voter or telling the voter that they could assist the voter in completing the ballot. The voter, continued to insist that he wanted to use the accessible ballot marking device. And he ended up having to wait an hour for the poll workers to figure out what they needed to do to get the audio ballot working on the ballot marking device. And, unfortunately, these stories are not uncommon. And, they do happen.
Right. And not only is it very frustrating and disruptive, but probably some people maybe just give up after a while too.
Well,
right?
that's exactly right. They do. They give up and they either leave without voting, which is really, really sad, or they end up voting with assistance when they wanted to do it privately and independently.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything did you want to share, Alyssa? Like,
Yeah, so I remember two situations which I thought were pretty egregious. One had to do with a person wanting to bring someone in particular in to vote to assist, and the election judge creating a fuss and challenging whether that person was appropriate or not. Another one was a parent complained to us because her son, who had developmental disabilities, was voting, and the election judge was challenging, saying inappropriate things about his ability to vote. And it does worry me when I see on the news today some of the quote unquote monitoring of election places or election ballot drops. Someone with a visible disability being challenged in terms of their eligibility to vote. And I find that, very troubling and upsetting. And I imagine that it goes on. And also just being, not creating those pathways for people whose lives are can be difficult. So, it might take some extra. I know we're going to talk about what to do, but for some people with disabilities, you have to do some extra planning. If you're not voting by mail or you're not voting on an absentee ballot, you might need to plan for transportation. So I do remember a person doing paratransit, and their paratransit ride never came and they never got to vote. So, there are these barriers that others don't necessarily have to think about. But if you're relying on someone else for assistance, you're relying on someone else for transportation. Sometimes things go wrong and plans don't happen as you'd like, and your right to vote is compromised.
Thank you. Well, thankfully, there are organizations like Luann's organization that does, advocate on behalf of voters with disabilities. So, as I mentioned, there was just this excellent article yesterday in the Sun about the efforts of Luann and the National Federation of the Blind. So, Luann, would you like to just go ahead and maybe talk about some of the lawsuits that you have been involved with on behalf of voters with disabilities?
Sure. So here in Maryland, and most of our recent litigation has been around accessible vote by mail. We did have one other case here in Maryland, and I'll talk about that too. But back in 2014, Maryland had a online ballot marking tool that originally had been developed for use by military and overseas voters, which we call UOCAVA voters for short, which comes from the Uniformed Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. That system, through advocacy efforts, legislation was passed to make that system available to voters with disabilities. And this is something that Alyssa and I worked very closely on. The legislation required that the system be certified by the governor-appointed State Board of Elections. They delayed doing that. There were many meetings that Alyssa and I went to at the state board, hearings to talk about the system and how, federal law, state law required that it be made available, and that, the State Board of Elections needed to do that. And they just delayed and delayed and delayed. And finally, I got kind of fed up with it and went to the president of the National Federation of the Blind and said, we need to do something about this. And so the National Federation of the Blind filed a lawsuit, NFB Lamone, and the court found in our favor, stating that Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act required that voters with disabilities be able to vote absentee from home, privately and independently, like any other absentee voter. So that system then subsequently was made available for the first time to voters with disabilities in the general election of 2016. Following that case, we subsequently filed a case in Ohio, and that case ended with a judgment that the state of Ohio needed to provide an accessible way to vote by mail to voters with disabilities in that state. We've also have filed cases in New York and Michigan. We currently have cases in the state of Alabama and Bexar County, Texas. So far we've had the same outcome in all these vote by mail cases where the courts have ordered the state to provide an accessible way to vote by mail to voters with disabilities. We also just last week sent a demand letter to the Secretary of State for the state of North Dakota, where legislation was passed a year ago to permit electronic ballot delivery and return in that state. They have yet to implement that law and provide the accessible way to vote by mail. So we sent a demand letter last week, and we'll see where that goes. So we also filed another lawsuit against the Maryland State Board of Elections a couple of years ago around how the express vote ballot marking device is implemented in polling places here in Maryland. The primary ballot marking method now since 2016 has been hand marking of ballots at the polling places. With the accessible ballot marking device being reserved primarily for voters with disabilities. And when the state selected the express vote as their accessible ballot marking device, that raised a lot of concerns among the disability community. And again, Disability Rights Maryland, ALYSA, the National Federation of the Blind, the National Federation of the Blind of Maryland, we really launched a huge advocacy effort to ensure that voters with disabilities who use that system would have a secret ballot, because that system does produce a ballot that is different in size from the hand marked ballot. It's very long and narrow, and it's different in content. It only shows the candidates that the voter has selected for each contest, whereas the hand marked ballot shows every candidate. And of course, the voter fills in the bubble to make their selection. So it's a very different looking ballot. So as a result of those advocacy efforts, the state, first the state said that I think that they would have at least 10 people. Well, let me back up a little bit. The state had actually requested the Attorney General to make an opinion about what if the state could actually purchase or release a system that produced a different ballot, and if they did, what they would have to do in that situation to ensure that the voters with disabilities would have a secret ballot. And the Attorney General's opinion said, well, you have to have a sufficient number, without defining what that meant, a sufficient number of people without disabilities using that system. So initially, I think the State Board of Elections said that they would have 10 people, a total of 10 people at each polling place use the ballot marking device. Then there were some issues around that some candidates had around where their name was on the ballot marking device. It can only show, I forget how many, there's a certain minimum number or a maximum number of candidate names that can be shown per screen on the ballot marking device. And there were a number of contests, where there were more than, I think, 10 candidates. So that means it would be 2 screens for that contest. And so they were concerned about that. And there was also some concern about going from one screen to the other, that voters would be confused. So as a result of all that, they reduced the number from 10 to 5. So five was the minimum number of people per polling place that were to use the ballot marking device. So following the 2016 and 2018 elections, we obtained data from the Maryland State Board of Elections to see how many people they actually had, how many people actually used the express vote in each polling place. And there were many, many, many polling places where there were less than 5 voters using the ballot marking device. There were many polling places where there was only 1 person using the ballot marking device. And there were a number where there was no one using the ballot marking device. So we expressed our concerns about that with the State Board of Election, and that, we needed to see some improvement. However, there really wasn't any improvement following the 2018 election cycle. And so the National Federation of the Blind of Maryland and the National Federation of the Blind decided to file a lawsuit with the goal really being to have the ballot marking device being the primary ballot marking method. Because there really are advantages of the ballot marking devices over hand marking the ballots. You can't have, there are no stray marks on the ballots produced by the ballot marking device, whereas hand marked ballots, stray marks are a problem. You can't overvote a contest with the ballot marking device, whereas you can with when you're hand marking a ballot, and then that ballot will be rejected, or if it gets through, then there's it has to be reviewed. And if you're using a ballot marking device and you haven't printed the ballot, you can change your mind if you want to change your mind about how to vote a contest. Whereas if you're hand marking a ballot and you change your mind, you got to start all over again. And this was also the goal of the lawsuit was to ensure that voters with disabilities who are using the ballot marking device had a secret ballot. We ended up settling that case. And as part of the settlement agreement, the State Board of Elections agreed to a minimum number of 10 people using the ballot marking device. And we also produced a training video showing how poll workers should interact, how to properly interact with a blind voter from the time they enter the polling place through inserting the ballot into the tabulator. So we've received data from the state board following the 2022 primary. And it did show a pretty significant improvement. Most of the polling places did have at least 10 people using the ballot marking device. Another one of the primary requirements of the settlement agreement was that every voter would be offered either the paper ballot or using the ballot marking device. And anecdotally, from what I've heard, that was indeed done in many polling places.
It was done in mine.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I think things are better now for in-person voting here in Maryland anyway, as a result of that lawsuit and settlement. We didn't get exactly what we were hoping for, but I think we did get a better experience for blind voters. So yeah, I don't know, I may have gotten some of the I don't know, Alyssa, did I get, I may not have gotten the original number, minimum number of voters.
Oh, well, I was laughing inside because one, this is taking me back to
Yeah.
a nightmare time.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Two, Luann, you might remember, like, informally, it was really first at 30. And
That's
then
right. I
all
was
of a
gonna say, was
sudden
it
it was
20
down
or
to
was it
10, and then it was down
5?
to
Yeah,
5.
yeah.
And just arguing
Yeah,
about
crazy.
offering,
Mm.
I mean, and then actually on my own experience, so my husband and I, we always, and I also tell my kids, whenever you vote, always ask for the ballot marking device, always make sure you vote on that.
Yeah,
Just because it's an easy thing to do and it serves,
exactly.
it's a good thing to do.
Yeah,
And I was denied a poll worker.
yeah.
This was, I think, I don't know, but it was probably the 2018.
Yeah.
Told me I wasn't allowed to use it. And of course I argued back and pulled out all my legal whatever tools, and she backed off. But
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
no,
they were actually openly discouraging people from using the ballot marking device in 2016 and 2018. It was pretty bad.
and also one of the problems is many, this is a known fact that many poll workers are older and intimidated by, this is broad generalizations, and I apologize for making such a broad statement, but I think there was concern that some of the older election poll workers were intimidated by the technology of the ballot marking device and how to turn it on and how to troubleshoot, and so it was just easier to discourage people from using it. So
Yeah, I was wondering why they would discourage it. Okay, that makes sense.
literally, when Luann said that some were not even plugged in, I saw that, they were not even plugged in.
Yeah, I remember getting a call from a member of ours who lives in Catonsville, Maryland, and the machine when she arrived wasn't set up, and the election judges didn't really know how to set it up, and that's the one that was not plugged in. The poll workers didn't know where the headphones were, and I'm like, well, usually they're velcroed to the side of the machine, and sure enough, her granddaughter who was with her found the headphones velcroed to the side of the machine. So you really have to be persistent when you're a voter with a disability.
So, just related to this, and this might actually give organizations like yours, Luann, more work in the near future, and that is that I think we're all aware of the fact that over the last couple of years, there have been several states, namely, Florida, Georgia, Texas, several others that have created laws that have put additional barriers, not in the way of people's ability to exercise their right to vote. Not so much, I think, directed against people with disabilities, but in general have created additional hurdles. And some of these things is obstacles to voting by mail, and ID requirements, and limits on what election officials can do to promote voting access. So, it would seem like this is going to have an effect, right? Even though it may not be the target on individuals with disabilities. So did you want to, I think, Luann, maybe you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah. So in 2021 at our national convention, the members of the National Federation of Blind adopted a resolution condemning the adoption of these voter suppression laws. And they are creating barriers to many voters with disabilities. The voter ID requirement, not all blind people have IDs. They don't drive, they may not travel, and requiring them to obtain an ID can be a burden, especially if they live in a rural area where there's no public transportation. If they live on SSI or SSDI, they may not have the funds to pay someone to take them to some remote location to get an ID. So, these are barriers. There are states that are requiring certification of a disability if you want to vote absentee. Alabama is one of those. If you're a person with a disability and you want to vote absentee, you need to have a form certified by a medical doctor that you have a disability. That's intrusive. And it's a hurdle. It's an unnecessary burden. Your ability to vote absentee should not depend on, having a doctor certify that you have a disability. It's got nothing to do with your ability to vote. So these types of laws are burdens that make voting more difficult for people with disabilities, and they have nothing to do with the security, making the elections process more secure. They just keep people from voting. So we oppose them.
Well, I'm glad, and thank you. Did you want to comment at all about that, Alyssa?
Yeah, I just want to say, a lot of times people say, well, what's the big deal to get, an ID? Like, it's part of life, it's part of whatever. And it's really not recognizing the challenges that some individuals face, both either by disability or economically or whatever factor. And I think it really, personally, I think it goes in the face of particularly the National Voter Registration Act, which was set out to increase voter participation and to take down those barriers, those administrative barriers that become real obstacles. So I find it, every year when I was at Disability Rights Maryland, the voter ID law would come up during the Maryland legislature. And every year I would just change the date on my testimony and submit it. We're very fortunate in Maryland. Maryland has definitely taken very proactive steps to make voting, it's not perfect, but make voter registration more accessible. For example, we have, people might not know this, in Maryland and there are many other states. I think there are, I looked this up, maybe 22 other states that have same-day voter registration. So that means that you can register to vote on the same day that you cast your ballot. And that's really significant, because if you're a busy person and you've moved and you realize, I didn't change my voter registration, same day voter registration solves that problem, because you can go and register and vote at the same time. So it's those kinds of expansive legislative actions which promote voting, as opposed to putting up barriers. I'm proud of Maryland in that capacity. They have not been perfect in other ways, but I think that's, I commend, our legislature in that regard.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so then, all right, so we've talked about barriers, we've talked about legal rights that individuals have. So just a broad question. So how can individuals with disabilities, how can they protect their rights? Either one of you?
Well, I would just say, yeah, go ahead, Lan.
Well, yeah, I was just, vote for one thing. And if, you show up at the polling place and the machine's not set up, you just have to assert your rights. You have to be firm, but you have to be polite. The election judge is not the enemy. They usually want to do the right thing and help you. But they may need to figure things out. So just, insisting that you do have the right to vote privately and independently, and that you are not going to leave until you get the opportunity to exercise that right. And I think that's really, the best way to ensure that that happens, is by people demanding it and exercising it.
Okay. Thank you. Alyssa?
Well, I would just say, one, I think it's important to know what your rights are. So, we had a list, obviously you have the right to register to vote. You have the right to vote in an accessible polling place. You have to, the right to vote early in an early voting center if your area has one. You have the right to vote by absentee ballot here in Maryland. You have the right to cast a private and independent ballot. The right to receive voting assistance. The right to cast your ballot on an accessible machine. The right to cast your ballot if you're in line before the polling place closes. Another important one is the right to vote a provisional ballot. If there's some reason that your name isn't on the registration list and there's a question about your eligibility to vote, you have the right to vote a provisional ballot. So I think, knowing what your rights are, and of course, what Luann said is the most important thing is registering and actually voting. I think, I say this, but I am not an election judge, but I do always like to encourage people to become election judges because we do need election judges, and we need training of election judges, and we need to keep supplying that core group of individuals that serve that very important role. I think encouraging others to vote, and the disability, we used to wear these signs, these buttons, the power of the disability vote. And increasing access and participation is just important, not just obviously for people with disabilities, but young people, old people, just generally, to make sure that we are not taking for granted this very critical, fundamental right. Not anything to take for granted.
So know your rights and then be persistent about trying to enforce those rights. Is there actually a handy place where voters can actually see what kind of rights they have? Do you know of anything like that? Like a website to just list?
Well, I have one right now.
That's very nice. Who's that published by?
Well, that's from Disability Rights Maryland that we did.
Okay.
Back.
Cool.
And so the other thing to tell folks, and people probably know this, but every state has a protection and advocacy agency called a PNA. The National Disability Rights Network is the umbrella organization, but we are, Disability Rights Maryland, Disability Rights New Jersey. Some have different names, but Disability Rights, I don't know if Ohio does that same, the way the title of the organization. But if you're looking for a disability advocacy organization in your state and you're not in Maryland, there's a PNA in your state, and most, if not all, PNAs get grants through the Help America Vote Act, through HAVA funds, and do advocacy, training, education on voting rights. So that's one place to go. The election protection, which has a website, is just, if you just type in election protection, or you can also call 866-OUR-VOTE. They can also assist you in figuring out where your polling site is, answering questions about voting rights. That's where you can also lodge a complaint if you had a bad experience or you're concerned that your rights were violated. Vote411.org is another. It kind of connects you to election protection. And I'm sure there are many others. Luann, any that you can think of?
Well, the Election Assistance Commission has prepared a sort of pocket size, I don't know, it's a little larger than pocket size, brochure for voters with disabilities that lists what your rights are. It's in large print and braille, and you can obtain copies of those for free from the Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal agency. And there's other resources on that website regarding voting and information for voters with disabilities.
That's great. Close the door, close the door. Close the door.
And I actually just found that, so I'm going to put that in the chat
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa.
if that works.
Well, great. I mean, it's wonderful to hear all these resources that are out there. So if individuals want to take it, one step further, if you will, and actually want to, do what both of you either have done or are doing, and actually advocate for voting rights for people with disabilities. I mean, how can people get involved in such advocacy?
Well, there's many states have a Rev Up campaign. So that's a program of the American Association of People with Disabilities. So if their state has that, that's something that they can certainly get involved with. The National Federation of Blind has affiliates in all 50 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. So you can certainly work with them in their efforts for voting advocacy. There's any number of disability rights organizations, I'm sure would be happy to have you all work with them in voting advocacy efforts.
There's also the League of Women Voters does a lot in terms of just getting the vote out and ensuring, that folks have access to election information. And also, the idea of making disability rights an issue that's brought that other organizations also consider, right? So that it's not just people with disabilities who are advocating, it's that we have universal accessibility is the goal, right? So that if we are universally accessible, you don't have to have, special accommodations because, if everyone's using the ballot marking device, as Luann said, that's universal accessibility. No one is treated differently. We're all treated the same and we all can access. And that's the goal, not just in voting, but obviously elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, so at this point, I mean, we have about another 15 minutes or so. So just open up to questions from some others on this call. Anybody have any questions for Luann and Alyssa? Come on, somebody must have some questions. I guess your presentation has been so crystal clear.
Yeah, they're making you do all the work, Fred. You've asked.
I'll go ahead and kick it off while people are pondering their questions. Alyssa, you mentioned earlier about some of the things involving both people who are, currently, we'll just say, not living at home, and others who are perceived as having intellectual or learning differences, and how that impacts their perceived ability to vote. To me, that strikes right at the heart of the stigma that we're trying to combat, that having a certain kind of disability or living in a certain kind of setting automatically means that you don't have the capacity to make an informed voting choice. So could you drill down a little bit more on that and kind of, just walk through dispelling that myth with us once and for all?
Right. I mean, I think the words you used, we don't have to make an informed voting decision. There's no, that's the whole idea, is the right to vote is so personal and your own, and you get to decide on what basis you're making that decision. And so, when we did trainings, people might disagree, but if for example, I can't remember the exact language, but in the guardianship bill, the language was that you retained your right to vote unless a court of competent jurisdiction determined by clear and convincing evidence that a person could not, with accommodations, communicate now I'm going to get the end wrong, communicate a voting choice, right? So it's that if you can communicate a choice, for whatever reason you make that choice, if you can communicate a choice with or without accommodations and assistance, you could vote. And that's really the fundamental, that's not a bar, it's not a standard. I don't know what qualification. And so if you have a cognitive disability, if you have a reading disability, if you are unable to read, that's why we don't have a literacy test. Your right to vote should not be encumbered or curtailed in any way. There's a lot in terms of, we're not talking about the criminal justice system here, but there are many people I just read a statistic, and I can't remember the number, but it was a ginormous number about the number of people who have prior conviction of a felony who have lost their right to vote. And in many states, you don't get that back. And that's why expungement is so important. And Maryland here too has done the right thing in terms of if you've already served I can't remember exactly the law, but it's if you're not on you've served your time, you're not on probation, you get back the right to vote, which I think is the right. We want to expand the pool of voters, right? We want to expand and be inclusive and include as many voices. So what happens is that there are these barriers of people who have lost their freedom, who are in psychiatric facilities, for example. They are not free to leave to go and vote. And they're relying on others to make sure that the right to vote is preserved. And that's a really tenuous kind of difficult place to be. So.
Thank you, Alyssa. Other questions from the group?
I don't have a question, but I'd like to just share a recent positive experience we've had.
Sure.
My name is Laura Gibson. I'm the director of Central Iowa Center for Independent Living. And we partnered with IRIS, which is Iowa Radio Reading Information Systems for the Blind and Print and Handicapped, and the Harkin Institute. And we had a 2-day early voting satellite location that was fully accessible. We had a sign language interpreter. We had all of the poll workers were well versed on all of their machines. We had a lot of machines that were ready to use. And we had about 171 people go through in the 2 days we did it.
That's great. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was really good.
That's awesome. Was transportation provided for people to get there?
It was not. And when we did our debrief on how we're going to do better, that was one of the things that we were hoping to offer. On election day, we do the vote mobile, so people can come or sign up if they need a ride, and we'll get them to the polls.
Yeah.
And since it was an early voting location, it could serve any precinct in
Right.
Polk County. Whereas if we had just done it on election day, we could have only served where we sit. So
Right. That's great.
yeah.
So transportation is definitely can be a huge barrier. And you're also reminding me of individuals who are perhaps served by the Developmental Disabilities Administration here in Maryland. That's what they're called. And they might be living in a group home, for example.
Mhm.
And you're relying on, care workers to make sure that you can access the right to vote. And again, many people aren't even thinking. It's not even on the to-do list. It's not on anyone's plan.
Yep. Yeah. So in our debrief, we did surveys too, as people came out of the polling and said, how was it? Did we hit, get it? Is there anything we could have done to make this easier for you or more accessible? And most everyone said we did a pretty good job. There was some issues with signage. Someone did say transportation.
Okay.
We ordered some of the little sign
guides
squares that we had one, but we ended up having multiple people with vision impairment go through. So next time we'll have them for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is a learning process and each time, but that's great that you took that on.
Yes, we
Thanks
were
for
pretty
sharing
pleased
that.
about it.
So I just wanted to read a comment by Elizabeth in the chat, and maybe Luann and Alyssa have some reaction to this. So I wanted to make a comment regarding how it may be difficult for certain individuals to fill in a ballot within the circles for each candidate. This is true with many people with learning disabilities who have difficulty with fine motor skills, and then makes, sort of relates that to how some of the same individuals have issues on filling out the SAT. Is that something that either of you have come across?
Oh, absolutely. That's where electronic ballot delivery really solves that problem. You can use a computer with whatever access technology you use, screen reader, screen magnification, refreshable braille display, dictation, whatever, to mark your ballot. And you don't have to, handle the ballot. You don't have to fill in the little bubbles with a pencil. So it's also really the only truly accessible way for a deafblind person to vote, because they can use the refreshable braille display to move through the ballot and mark the ballot. So and then if the state also permits electronic return, that makes the process totally accessible.
And also in a polling place, the give it accessible ballot marking device should be made available.
Right.
So that if anyone goes in, they should not be turned away. And that's the other thing is if someone doesn't have a visible disability, the poll worker back in the day would maybe say, well, why are you using this? And when that woman did that to me, I'm like, you have no idea whether I have a disability or not. So.
So a question just came to my mind as listening to all this. I mean, all these rights that voters have and efforts that both of you have been involved in the past to try to make those rights real. Are there, I mean, is it working, I guess? I mean, are there statistics to show what the percentage of individuals with disabilities are voting? And is that lower than the general population? And is it improving?
Yeah, well, I think overall, the percentage of people with disabilities who vote is lower than the population of voters who do not have disabilities. Now, we have found that within the membership of the National Federation of Blind, they are registered and vote at a rate that's higher than the average voter. So I think having that connection, with an advocacy organization makes a difference. Not every blind voter is connected with an organization of blind people. And there are, so I think that can make a difference. But typically voters with disabilities do vote at a lower rate.
Mm-hmm.
The other hard thing is being able to capture that information.
Mm-hmm.
Because while you can, particularly in America, you can say whether you need voter assistance on your registration, there's really no other way to know if a person has a disability when they're voting.
Mm-hmm. All right, makes sense. Any other questions from anybody? All right, we have a few minutes left, so I guess I have another question too. So I think it's been mentioned a few times, but a lot of the discussion so far has been about having accessible voting. We haven't talked as much about the registration process. I mean, you mentioned, Alyssa, same-day registration. I mean, are there, I mean, I can imagine that there's difficulties with people with disabilities in registering, right? Transportation, maybe even, issues about getting into the place and things like that. Do either of you want to comment about that?
Many states do offer an online form to register to vote. However, that form may not be accessible for a person who uses a screen reader. So that's definitely an issue. And of course, the paper form presents many problems to people with disabilities. But it doesn't have to be that way. So if these forms are created in accordance with the web content accessibility guidelines, then they will be accessible. I believe the state of Maryland, the State Board of Elections, makes their online voter registration form, which is accessible, available to any state for free. So, if you all live in a state where their online voter registration form isn't accessible, you might want to say, hey, take a look at the Maryland form. You can get that for free. So yeah, it is an issue.
Mhm. Alyssa, any thoughts on that?
No, I will say, if you don't register in person and you use the online, for example, the first time you go to vote, you do have to show ID, even if you're in a state that's not an ID voter ID state. So that's just something to know, because at some point you're gonna have to show something.
Right, and that can create some of the problems you said
Yeah.
before about
Right.
not having the IDs that at least they're familiar with.
Right.
Okay, well, it's about time to, I think, close the webinar. But first of all, I want to thank Alyssa and Luann, first of all for coming tonight, but also just for your great efforts over the years. I mean, just all you've done to try to make voting accessible is really very admirable. So I'm thanking you on my behalf, and maybe others as well. And then for this excellent discussion. It's been incredibly informative. I've learned a lot. I think others have as well. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me. I know I haven't been in this work for a while, but if anyone really wants to learn from an expert, reach out to Luann at NFB. She knows everything, knows everyone, and is just a force.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me as well. And it's been a pleasure to work with Alyssa once again on voting. It's great times what we had in the past, and great fights. And we'll look forward
not amongst us, but again,
right.
others, right?
Against the election officials.
Yeah.
Yes.
They would see us coming and be like, roll their eyes, like, oh no, not these two again.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Yes, thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Thanks for attending. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.